it's not just about trying to get universal consensus because we understand that that isn't going to happen. It's about understanding here. I think what I would say is much of the time when I look at political discourse in this country, whether it's municipal or otherwise, I think a lot of the time there's a particular subset of the population that have almost come to understand themselves as the legitimate subjects of municipal governance, of governance in general. These are taxpayers, they're property owners, they're business owners, they're so on. And when I say everybody, what I mean is I'm trying to cast that net a lot wider than some political discourse has done. And I'm trying to make sure that the voices of the hundreds of people a night that sleep in emergency shelters, the hundreds of people in St. John's that are in the sex industry, that are sex workers, the hundreds of, the thousands of people who may use drugs, for example, queer and trans people, voices that have not been typically elevated or even heard in our political systems. I want to make sure that they're incorporated too.
Welcome to Cross Border Interviews, the show where we dive into the insights of municipal political leaders from across Canada. Now, our mission on this show is quite simple. Shine a light on the dedicated individuals who day in and day out work around the council table to shape the communities that we call home. And for today's episode, we are sitting down and chatting with St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador Councillor Ophelia Ravencroft. St. John's is the perfect combination of big city luxury and traditional small town charm. It is one of the oldest and most easterly cities in North America and has become a rare destination full of character and charisma with a contemporary, sophisticated edge. Wander down the narrow, criss-crossing streets naturally carved by horse and carriage, past the colorful jellybean row houses wedged together, lining the sides of steep hills and hidden alleyways. Once you've meandered down to the harbour, look towards the Narrows and imagine a time when the waters were brimming with fishing schooners. Now, as you explore the city, stroll along some of the oldest streets in the world and visit the many, many shops, boutiques, lively pubs and cafes, and unique art galleries. Perhaps you will make room in your luggage for a reminder of your visit. Traditional or modern, our artisans in Newfoundland and Labrador are always expressing themselves in a colorful and exciting ways. Councillor, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about yourself and talking about your great community. Before we get into your community of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, I want to get to know the person behind the persona of councillor for a few minutes. Where did your sense of duty to serve your community come from, Ophelia?
I don't really know how to put this. So I ran first. So I'll give you a little of my my more extended backstory. I've been involved with community activism and local advocacy stuff for the best part of a decade at this point. Very nearly, in fact, that much. I transitioned back in 2016, went full time in 2016, and at that point, the trans community here is very powerful and vocal and strong, and I really appreciate the efforts that have been made. But obviously, in 2016, our community was not in the place we wanted to be virtually anywhere. We were still seeing significant efforts toward advancing our rights and pressure that was being placed on governments. And between that and other journeys that I was involved in, such as sex worker justice activism, which started for me back around 2017, I found myself coming into contact with systems of government quite a bit. And over time, as somebody with an interest in politics and an interest in community service and trying to advance rights for populations and groups like the ones that I'm a part of, I thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity here, and perhaps eventually this will, something will open up. And if I know that it's the right move for me, then it'll make itself clear at that time. Back in 2020, during the pandemic, my dear friend Hope Jameson, the former Ward 2 councillor, stepped down to take a job with a national outfit, and their seat was vacated, and so the by-election was going to take place. And it was during the pandemic. I don't think anybody was really doing a whole lot at that point, during, just coming out of the first lockdown and trying to readjust to this new life that we all had. And I thought, well, maybe I have an opportunity here. So I jumped into the race for the by-election and ran a campaign that was very focused on some of the pieces of advocacy that I've been engaged in for a long time, some very directly relevant to my community, others that were a bit more general. Things like sidewalk snow clearing was a really big one for me. We in St. John's, obviously, being in Newfoundland, we get a significant amount of snow in the winter, but we didn't always cart that off the sidewalks or many of the sidewalks in a particularly efficient manner. So I wanted to advocate for some increased investment there. And my thinking was, even if I couldn't get the seat, that I'd wind up raising awareness of some of those things, and we'll see where that goes. So I lost that one somewhat narrowly. I came in second in that by-election out of 8 candidates for a first-time candidate and someone with no political experience and no party affiliation. I was very satisfied. So I immediately declared again, keeping in mind that we were coming up into a municipal election year just the next year, and instantly ran essentially a year-long campaign. And then in 2021, I was fortunate enough to get elected. So I think what it comes from was just seeing municipal politics as a way of taking the work that I'd already been doing, stuff that, I was engaged in community and getting a bit of control or the levers of power and being able to hopefully affect some of the change that I wanted to see.
I have to ask a follow-up question. I apologize if this comes from a space of ignorance or
Not at
sort of
all. Not at all.
unknown. When you ran in 2020, you self-described you were transitioned at that time because you started the
Yes.
transition in
Yes.
2016. Would you have been the first, and are you the first trans Newfoundland and Labradorian St. Johnian to be on council in the province and in the city, or is
So,
there another?
so I am the first trans person elected in St. John's. I am also the first openly non-binary person that was elected in the province. I'm not the first one to run in St. John's. Jennifer McCreath predated me. I believe she ran in 2017. And I'm not the first person elected in the province. Charlotte Gaucher in the town of Gillams, a town of 400 people out on the island's west coast, I think it's in the west coast, was elected slightly before me as well. And so I give all credit to Charlotte as the first trans person to be elected in the province. I'm not the first one to run in the city. I'm not the first one elected in the province, but I do hold a couple of firsts there that I'm proud to be able to carry forward.
Did you want to be the first? Because you're kind of a
Um,
trailblazer in that sense now, because now people will look and say there is a space for myself on council because Ophelia did it beforehand and others have gone before her. Have you sort of, do you feel like you have a responsibility now to make sure that when you were on council and as you were on council, you're doing the best job that you can, even as a trans person?
I mean, yeah, I think so. I definitely ran in part on grounds that, at the time that I ran during the by-election, none of us had been elected. Charlotte's election came after my by-election was lost. So I'm grateful to her for, again, for the work that she's done, and that's a significant thing, and I won't take that away from her. But yeah, I think it wasn't necessarily so much about me feeling that I wanted to be the first, as feeling that I wanted someone to be in a position like this. Having not had trans people elected in the province before, at a point late in 2020 when we were seeing, you know, huge swells, groundswells of support, I think, for our community in nationally, internationally, and so on. I felt it was really important that trans people be able to look at systems of government and see people like ourselves reflected in them. Because I think often there's a belief, particularly when it comes to municipal politics, that the work that's being done here is just kind of, for those of us who are queer, who are trans, who are non-binary, that it's a bit divorced from us and that we don't see faces like ours, we don't see experiences or perspectives like ours reflected around these tables. So me, wanting to do this was not necessarily about personal pride as much as it was just about, hey, we got a community here and I think that we deserve to see ourselves there. And if that's me, it's me. And if it's not me, that's okay too. I've definitely been, I think the proudest moments I've had in my tenure on council have been those points of engagement with particularly trans youth who've come out to hear me speak at rallies, who've seen me in the media, who've wound up having conversations with their family about trans identities, in some cases who have flagged that maybe they felt comfortable transitioning or being open about themselves because they saw me out in public. We're a city here of 115,000 people in St. John's proper, about 250,000 in the metro area. And the media in this province is pretty centralized. And as a consequence, word gets around really quickly. So that visibility is not difficult to attain here. And I'm proud of that. It's meant a lot to me that my presence has in any way been able to contribute to positive discourse and perception of my community in the province.
Again, I'm going to ask a very sensitive question, and I apologize, but
That's okay.
has it
That's
been
okay.
all good? Has your
No,
experience on,
and
and I'm not trying to be rude,
uh,
and I'm not trying to make
no,
people
no,
feel,
no.
because I want people to go away thinking that the experience that you're having is not the good stuff that you just talked about, but there is some potential pitfalls as well, because we're seeing a rise in trans hate, trans abuse in this country and in the
Yeah,
United States. And you're sort of, I'm going to poster child to sort of say, this is what you can do. It hasn't all been good, has
right.
it? And like, you don't need to say anything if you don't want to. And I apologize if I'm asking something out of context. I just want to make sure that people know that you you are a trailblazer, but the trail is hard, isn't it?
No, it is. And, I don't, this is not, to be clear, you can ask any sensitive questions that you want to, and I'm still going to welcome that. Really, I think what I would want people to understand is that, there is a lot of duality in this experience, right? Yes, there's all that positive. There is a lot of negative that comes there too. There's been stuff to balance that out to a certain degree, but no, I feel very conflicted in some cases. When folks have asked me, for example, would you encourage more trans people to run for political office? The answer is always going to be yes, because I want to see more of us around these tables, and because the change that we need to affect is, I think, going to take place much more effectively and efficiently if more of us have access to that kind of power, which we deserve. We're a part of the population and we deserve to be represented. But at the same time as that, some of the experiences I've had have been so negative that there's definitely a degree of caution that I think you can hear in my voice sometimes when I talk about it. It's well known, and it made national news back in 21 when I ran, that I took transphobic death threats during my campaign, quite a few of them. And that resulted in this huge blow up. I had security concerns. I had folks that were looking out for me for ages. I still, to this day, I kind of watch my back when I'm in public in some cases. But even just being on council, some of the things that people will say and do to you, whether you hear about them directly, they're in your emails, they're in phone calls, or you hear about them behind your back, what kind of comments are being made. It's harsh. We are seeing this swell in transphobia in the last couple of years, driven, I think, by, far right politics and our neighbor to the south. I wonder if we can put a tariff on transphobia. Um, we're seeing all of that, and I think that is bleeding through into Canada pretty significantly, particularly in that kind of post-convoy world, post-Ottawa occupation world. We've definitely seen more of this, and Newfoundland has not been immune to that. We have a very powerful um, group of trans activists here who are wonderful to work with and who have done incredible work in foregrounding our community safety and security. Shout out to many within the queer and trans communities, people like Sarah Worthman, for example, the No Space for Hate movement, many that have been involved with that. Randy Whalen, an incredible young Two-Spirit activist, folks that I've worked with extensively, and I'm really grateful to them for that. But yeah, when you open your email and you have a person in there saying, and I think I'm almost quoting with this one, man, woman, or whatever you are extremely ugly on all three levels. When you have something like that in your inbox, it really starts to make you question, did I make the right call here? It's very, very difficult to endure. So yeah, there has been a lot of frustration. I'm really grateful to my colleagues around the council table who have been very supportive and defensive of me when people have engaged in that kind of activity. All the staff in City Hall here have been fantastic, absolutely fantastic to deal with as well. But yeah, I think it's a difficult thing to be a member of a marginalized population and then take office in a situation like this, because you do kind of feel like you have a target on your back. And people have said many times when it comes to public abuse and this kind of thing, oh, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. And my standard statement is, don't ask whether I can stand the heat, ask who set the kitchen on fire.
Mhm. And that's the
You
big
know,
thing, right? We always think that we should all retreat, but it's why are we retreating? Who is the person that is responsible for that request to retreat? And I couldn't have said it better myself with that. Who is actually setting the kitchen on fire? I want to turn to sort of the role of counselor for a few minutes before we turn to the city of St.
sure.
John's. And
Yeah,
after 3 years, 3.5 years of being an elected official, you've had to make some very tough decisions around that council table. How do you make those decisions? What metrics do you put in place to ensure that you're making the best decision based on the entire community and not just a select people? Because you're there to represent everyone, even those who disagree with you or say vile
yeah,
things about you. You have to represent them, and for the best of the community, unfortunately, that is what has to happen. How do you make those
of
decisions?
course. Well, I think, it's when I look at my work outside of council too, I've been, involved in policy development and EDI work and so on for many years, concurrent with council, because in St. John's, as you may know, being a councillor is a part-time job. It's only the
What?
mayor and I think
What?
deputy mayor.
You're a
Yeah,
full-time job. You get paid full-time hours. That's what I hear. Like you're making hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's what everyone says to
yeah,
me.
I
That
know, I know.
oh,
We just enrich ourselves so much with this job, but we really don't. The pay is desperately needing to be increased, but we can talk more about that later. But yeah, I've done work concurrently with our provincial government, with the public college in the province, and a number of others in the time that I was on council that was focused on this kind of stuff. And my approach in many ways is very similar across all of that, right? My feeling is I come at all the work I do from an equity first perspective. And the goal in examining everything that I look at in any work that I'm doing is what kind of action can I take in this situation that will improve equity the most, whether it's social, economic, cultural, whatever, any gender equity. racial equity, anything. What can I do in this situation that will create the maximum positive impact for the maximum number of people, and that will substantially improve equity the most? So when you get a decision that comes before you, if you have that kind of lens on it, there are going to be situations where you wind up agreeing with one group or another, and sometimes the reasons for that can be, quite distinct or diverse. But that's ultimately the approach that I've taken to everything. There's definitely, I think, a perception in some cases that, there's always a gun to the head of councillors saying, are you only going to govern for a particular group of people? It might be, are you saying that you're only going to govern for the queer community, or are you only going to govern for homeowners or for a particular neighborhood? Ward 2, and the ward I represent, is also very diverse, covering a large subdivision that's just at the edge of like a decommissioned golf course, for example, and then also a substantial amount of public housing, by far the most, I think, of any ward. Most of the city of St. John's housing is in my ward. So yeah, it's, I think ultimately that lens, that equity lens, is the thing that has allowed me to kind of, move forward and be relatively internally consistent in the things that I'm doing. And ultimately, it's just like you said, we do have to govern in terms of everybody. So I'll give you an example. Just a couple days ago, we had a project that had come before us for approval. It was 34 micro units of designated affordable housing in the city's downtown core in a vacant office building. I thought it was a great conversion. And there was some public feedback on that. Some of it was quite positive, which I was really grateful to see. Some of it was pretty harsh. And it said things to the effect of, we bought homes in this area because there is a residential neighborhood that's very nearby. We're concerned about an increase in crime. We're concerned about an increase in, social problems, in unwanted behaviors. We're concerned it could turn into, there were various examples given of service providers and so on locally that people have associated with social problems, rightfully or wrongly. I would say mostly wrongly, but this is the kind of feedback that we got. And so in that situation, I've often heard people say, well, are you going to vote with your residents? And my answer is, yeah, I am voting with my residents. I have 20,000 of them. The reality of it is that a resident is not just an adjacent property owner. A resident of Ward 2 is the guy across the street from my house who's sleeping on a piece of cardboard. It's somebody who's in an emergency shelter. It's somebody who is precariously housed and is about to be evicted. It's someone who can't afford their housing and is struggling to feed their children. I have to be able to think about all of them. That's been the same whether it was a masjid in a residential neighborhood, whether it was affordable housing, whether it was various kinds of, development, construction, whatever. You got to be able to think about that total impact. And that's something that I've always tried to bring to the table too. So yeah, I agree. We do have to represent everybody, and we have to be clear that everybody really does mean everybody.
But everyone never agrees on 100% of the issues. Like
No, they don't.
there's
And
no
it's
issue. Even if you went outside and said the sky is blue right now, there's going to be about 10% of the population saying it is aquamarine, and I don't care what you say, it's aquamarine. How do you do that? Because no one's agreeing 100% of the time, and we live in a very much
no.
polarized world right now where I would even say like 10% of the population barely agrees on everything, let alone 100%.
It's never going to be possible to get universal agreement on everything. And when you enter into this position, you have to understand that there's virtually nothing that you're ever going to be able to do that everybody will agree on. We joke that if for folks who know St. John's well, the summer pedestrian mall in the downtown is the one thing we do that virtually everybody seems to like. And even then, it's not everybody, because we do get some complaints about it from a couple of business owners. But I think it's not just about trying to get universal consensus, because we understand that that isn't going to happen. It's about understanding here. I think what I would say is, much of the time when I look at political discourse in this country, whether it's municipal or otherwise, I think a lot of the time there's a particular subset of the population that have almost come to understand themselves as the legitimate subjects of municipal governance, of governance in general. These are taxpayers, they're property owners, they're business owners, they're so on. And when I say everybody, what I mean is I'm trying to cast that net a lot wider than some political discourse has done. And I'm trying to make sure that the voices of the hundreds of people a night that sleep in emergency shelters, the hundreds of people in St. John's that are in the sex industry, that are sex workers, the hundreds of, the thousands of people who may use drugs, for example, queer and trans people, voices that have not been typically elevated or even heard in our political systems. I want to make sure that they're incorporated too. And when we think about it numerically, in many cases, if we're talking about that development again, there's going to be hundreds of people that are precariously housed or unhoused in St. John's on a nightly basis, as opposed to, say, 5 or 10 that wrote letters complaining about a new development. That scale tips pretty easily for me.
Counselor, I want to turn to my next segment, and that is about the city of St. John's as a whole. But before I do that, I have a preamble that
Sure,
I need to get off the table, if you don't mind. For those who are listening,
absolutely.
this is a conversation between the counselor and myself. This is not a motion of council, not a direction of council, not a policy of council. This is the counselor's opinion and her opinion alone. Now, it may line up with what's going on at council, but at the end of the day, it's her opinion. She needs a majority of council members to vote in favor or against something, to move something forward, or to reject something. This is her opinion, and again, her opinion alone. Thank you so much for letting me do my preamble. I've done that now 850 times on this show, as you are my 850th guest.
Congratulations.
And I've got to ask a very overarching question. In your
Go
opinion,
on.
as of recording this in June 2025, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing or challenges facing the city of St. John's heading forward?
I think many of the things we're facing in some ways are, are concurrent with issues that I'm sure you're hearing from many of your interlocutors across the country. What are the biggest things? Poverty and housing. They're the two that I hear about the most frequently. They're not specific to us, but they do have obviously particular purchase. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we're a province with a notable amount of economic inequality, and as a consequence, yeah, we've struggled, I think, for many years with an underdevelopment of public housing, with high cost of building, with the financialized housing market. All of those things, I think, have resulted in a market housing shortage. We have started to see some significant improvement in that, incidentally, in the last year or so, with a lot more development coming forward that I think is going to markedly improve equity from on the housing front. But I definitely would say that's the thing that I hear the most about from my constituents. I think that public discourse, the same as anywhere, speaking as an individual councillor in terms of what is affecting the council, the level of public discourse and the level of hate and antagonism that is received can make it pretty difficult to do the job in some cases. There's many more that I could get into, but I think if you're looking for a broad answer around what do I think, people in my city need more than anything, the answer is simply money and is personal security. Those are issues that are affecting many in the country right now, as you know, and we are not immune to that, unfortunately.
So the natural follow-up question to that answer is, how do we solve it? How do we solve the issue? Because we can't go and print money for every single person. As a
We
municipal
can't.
councillor, how do you see your role in ensuring that that work doesn't stop and we find a solution that can help? Because you're right, it's a conversation I've had many times on this show,
I
but
believe it.
everyone's doing something differently. What is St. John's doing right now differently to help ensure people are finding homes, people are feeling safe and can afford groceries at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, there have been various internal initiatives, but we are a bit hamstrung in this way to a degree, right? So just to give you an example, for a couple of years, I served as the council lead for the nonprofit housing division. We've run 460 some odd units of nonprofit housing that are at either low end market rent or designated affordable. They're quite good, and we had a vacancy rate there that was a little bit higher than we wanted it to be between myself and the staff in the division. And then Councillor Ellsworth, who's now the lead there, we got that vacancy rate, I believe, down to close to zero. So that's one example of something where we directly have a lever that we can pull. Are we doing renovations faster? Are we adjusting our application processes or so on? Are we processing things differently, dealing with staffing, just to make sure we can literally get more people into houses and into the housing that they need and deserve? The problem, I think, in St. John's is that, much of what we hear a lot of the time, or what gets aimed at us, and I understand when people think this, assumes that we have far more control over some of these processes than we do. We in St. John's are subject to We've been pushing for new legislation from our provincial government for 30 or 40 years, longer than I've been alive. I'm 32 years old. We've been pushing for enabling legislation that would give us the ability to act more quickly on many things. And unfortunately, that's something that we still don't have. Most of the powers that deal with housing directly are not vested in us. They're vested in either the government of Newfoundland and Labrador or in the federal government. We were successful, for example, in applying for Housing Accelerator Fund monies. We got a great chunk of cash, and I'm really proud of the work that everybody put into this one, which have actually improved some things. We're seeing a lot more applications now, for example, for basement apartments, backyard suites, triplexes, fourplexes, larger apartment complexes, a lot of increased density, things being on public transit routes, parking minimums being waived, this kind of thing. This is the kind of stuff that we do have control over, and I think that council has shown a real willingness, which I'm grateful to them for, to get in there and do that kind of work. But unfortunately, a lot of whether it's around, do we literally just go out there and build more public housing, which I think is something that we need to do, just increase the nonprofit housing stock, the non-market housing stock. Do we have to look at the Residential Tenancies Act to make sure that tenants are being treated fairly, that landlords are not engaging in discriminatory practices? Do we need to look at rent control, rent stabilization? I've advocated for all these things very loudly in the provincial media, and I will continue to do that. But it's not something that I have the ability to pull a string and do myself. I'm waiting on another level of government to do that for us.
You were just at the most recent Federation of Canadian Municipalities convention in Ottawa, Ontario. Did
I was
this
indeed.
did these topics come up, and did you talk to other municipal leaders from across Canada or even across Newfoundland and Labrador about these issues and what the best practices they're doing? Because the best thing I've ever learned about municipalities is they steal from other municipalities when things are going right. So when you were there,
They
did you hear anything that you went, "Oh, we should try that in St. John's"?
It's a regular thing that I've talked to other leaders about, whether provincially or nationally. And it's not so much a question of, what can we steal? I think it's ultimately just a question of we have always we've tried our best to be very creative with the tools that are available to us. And I think that we've had some success with that. And in some cases, there has been, critiques or comments or whatever that have been aimed at us. So I think, it was in the news, for example, that when we sent in our initial Housing Accelerator Fund application, Minister Fraser came back to us at the time and said essentially, be a bit more creative, be more expansive, see if you can push harder, and then maybe we'll talk about it. And we wound up with an application based on various things that was a lot more expensive than it would have been otherwise. And I think we did that in part. There's always jurisdictional scans and so on being done to get some ideas about what we can accomplish. So I think that kind of collaborative work and the theft, as you say, of ideas from other municipalities, it's always going to happen. And the conversations in my end are virtually nonstop. I'm always willing to engage with anybody who's got more ideas. It's just a question of understanding that, particularly for Newfoundland and Labrador municipalities, in all cases, I think in this province, most of those powers have not been devolved to us. When I've talked to colleagues from, Toronto, for example, the level of leeway that they have in dealing with residential tenancies in non-market housing, aggression in development, density, anything along those lines is just so much bigger than anything that we have available to us. And it's deeply frustrating because I would love to be able to wave a wand and put, a couple thousand more units of housing in the city to deal with the shortage that we've got. And if I had those powers, I would have already exercised them. So yes, in many cases, there is that creativity and that, learning from others. And in some cases, it is recognizing that when someone else has put a brick wall in front of you, you got to try and smash it down somehow. But in some cases that, it can take a while to get that done, unfortunately. Municipal politics is a tough game sometimes.
I have about four more questions left, and I know I'm very pressed for time. So hopefully you're willing to just stick with us for at least an extra
Oh,
5-10
yeah.
minutes. Okay,
No,
perfect.
listen, I've got you've got me for a half hour if you need me.
Okay.
We're all good.
I want to flip the original question because we often only talk about the negative things in municipal life. What's
Sure.
going wrong? How do we fix it? But there are things that are going good in your community. There are things that are going great in Ward 2 of St. John's. There are things that are going good in St. John's as a whole. From your perspective as a councillor, what is the thing that makes you proud to be a resident of St. John, a councillor from St. John's, that you say, you know what, we do have our housing challenges, our affordability challenges, our own unique challenges, but at the end of the day, this is what we do right. What is that thing for you?
We do a lot. We've gotten to a point, I think, that one of the biggest things that I would point to, I think, is if you look at the shift in culture that's taken place in this province in the last 10 years, some of which has been driven demographically, some of which has been, there's been a lot of changes. The city, in many ways, I think, my grandfather, for example, is St. John's native. He doesn't live here anymore. He's up in Dartmouth, in my hometown. But I think, when he comes back now, I imagine that there are many surprises around the makeup of the city and how it looks and feels here now compared to what he remembers from 40 years ago. I think we've seen some significant strides in inclusion and in ensuring that people feel welcome, in ensuring that that the governance we engage in, that the work we do is reflective of the diversity of the city. That's something I can honestly feel pretty proud of. It's moments where I get the sense that people are willing to come together to stand up for each other and to defend things that maybe they didn't even think they would. Back in 2023, for example, when we started to see provincial protests, or threats of provincial protests, maybe I should say, around things like inclusive education and trans inclusion in schools and so on. I went to a counter rally at one point at the seat of government here, the Confederation building here in St. John's. We had, close to 500 people show up in a small community, a relatively small city, in the middle of the day on a Friday, to turn up for this thing because people here are determined to fight. We have the culture here in many ways is it can feel pretty beautiful. We take care of our own in some ways, and I think we are. I'm glad to know that people are prepared to stand up for diversity and stand up for inclusion, and to make sure that the city we're creating is one that is as forward-thinking as it can be. That's something that I've always tried to champion as a councillor, and whenever I've been able to engage with folks that are trying to do the same thing in their community, and there are a lot of them around that are doing exactly that, I'm really grateful to them for it.
I want to turn to my last segment, and it's my favorite one because I've booked my plane tickets, and I will be in St. John's later on this year. I know it's probably not the most
Fantastic.
colorful time, but it's going to be in the dead of winter in November. But I am coming, and I'm excited. What should I do for 2 days? What should tourists do in St. John's, whether it be the summer or in the winter, if they're coming through and visiting your beautiful community?
It's funny. I am a very unusual tourist in a lot of ways. When I take myself to another city, I find neighborhoods that I like and I park myself in them. I visit small businesses. I find a couple of restaurants or bars that I'm fond of. Usually it's me. So, what are the first things I ask? Where do the goths hang out? Where's your metal bars? Where's your gay bars? And so on. And that's when I was just in Ottawa, for example, I had a couple of great experiences at a restaurant called the Coven down on Murray Street in the Byron Market. Delicious burgers, and the one place where I can walk in and immediately know I'm gonna know and like all the music they're playing. But that's I say this as a preamble because I think when I encourage people to come to St. John's, we in many ways, particularly if you're in the city's downtown, honestly just wander. There's many things that we could point to as somewhat standard for tourists, particularly in some of the non-summer months, when maybe boat tours are not as numerous, for example. The Rooms Museum is wonderful, the Johnson Geo Center. There's a lot but honestly, I think if you're here, just kind of try to take it in. Walk up and down Water and Duckworth streets, find venues that you like. There's so much great live music in the city. If you like live music, you'll always be able to find performances on a good night. We have a fantastic restaurant culture here with many brilliant operators that are turning out some of the country's best food. Restaurants like Portage, for example, is a particular favorite of mine. Visit places like that. There's so much that I think when you live in a place, it can feel easy to take some things for granted. But when you're here, when you're immersed in it, you'll know you'll get that sense. You'll have an internal North Star that tells you what you like and what you don't, and where you want to go. This is a very funny answer in some ways, I know, particularly because you're coming here in the winter, and so like I said, I can't give you some of the well, some not the winter, the late fall, at the point that it's cold enough that I can't suggest, oh yeah, go to Bannerman Park and sit down on the grass because it's going to feel really uncomfortable. And Bannerman Park is beautiful, and so is Barring Park. But I can't suggest that you go on a boat tour because it's going to be pretty uncomfortable to be in the middle of the North Atlantic when it's like 3 degrees out.
That's
To the
perfect
fish
to me though.
artists who did
That's
that,
the thing.
congratulations.
Like I love
Yeah.
winter. Like this is my like
Oh,
prime
oh, you're gonna
tourist
love
season. Like I want to see the best of winter while I'm out in St. John's.
Absolutely. You'll have a great time, not just because of the winter. You'll genuinely enjoy it. You know, as somebody who wasn't born here, but whose parents were from here, I grew up for the first half of my life in Halifax, Nova Scotia, hearing stories about how gorgeous this place was. We would come here on vacation, and I remember what that feeling was like. And then when my mother and I finally made the decision that we were going to try to move here when I was in my kind of mid-teens, when I was about 14 or 15, I remember getting on planes constantly at a point that we had a booming oil industry in the province. We had many Newfoundlanders that were taking work away in the Diavik Diamond Mines and Fort McMurray and in other parts of the country. And what I remember at that time in getting on that plane and coming back here was a sense of joy in some ways and a sense of pride in everyone that they loved where they were from. They got to be home. They got to be in the culture that mattered to them. And they got to be surrounded by things that felt comfortable and right and safe. And that is something that we worked really hard to attain. And then my mother and I were able to be here, and now I'm here. And now I get to be part of the government that's in charge of the place, and that still feels kind of surreal for someone who dreamed about living here for so long. But
Does it
that
actually still
that
feel
feeling
surreal?
of pride, it does, honestly. It's so, and not least because I think I recognize that I am a very unconventional counselor for St. John's, but also kind of for the country. I stand out like a sore thumb at FCM, the same as anywhere else. I'm a I'm a 6 foot tall, purple haired, lesbian, transgender, non-binary, polyamorous, goth, metalhead, whatever. And that I have an unconventional background. I have
Happy
unconventional
Pride
personal
Month.
activism. Thank you. Happy Pride Month. Well, now in St. John's, actually, Pride is in July. I don't recall the historical reason, but for some reason we do the Pride Festival in July. So in St. John's we get twice as much pride, which is great. We should,
Calgary's in
because we're gay. So
September
my
because the gays don't want to overstep the Cowboys for Calgary Stampede. So we're like, we'll give the Cowboys their parade in June, and we'll take it in September.
But yeah, no, but it does still feel surreal is the answer. And even if I've come out of left field, even if there are things about me that are unconventional, it's a real sense of pride. And I hope that when you come here, you can feel that among the people here, and you can get that sense. It's to be immersed in this city. For those who've never been here, it's truly beautiful, and I do love this place. I really do.
Where's your favorite spot? After a long day of council meetings, after a long day of work, I can imagine there's days where you just need to decompress and just relax and just be by yourself.
Oh,
Is
very
there a
much.
spot in the
Oh, you have no
community?
idea.
Is there a spot in the community that you can go to? And I'm gonna kind of pigeonhole you here a little bit. You can't say your
No,
own
yeah.
house.
I wish I could. I've got it to a place I really like it there. I play a lot of Dead by Daylight, so I'm often just, or Five Nights at Freddy's games, so I'm just kind of at home playing horror games all night, reading a book, listening to records. When I'm out in the community, places that I feel secure, if I'm looking to have a night on the town or anything like that, we have a brilliant drag community in St. John's, and many of the performers are quite close friends of mine. I'll plug several of them here. In fact, Andrezi, Carmen Slaughter, Gravy, Vampira, Stella Starlet, my best friend, many, absolutely just claws, luminous, brilliant performers in the community. We had one queer bar that operated here for quite some time. It was called Velvet, that's recently closed. But still, the performers are doing regular shows in many other places around town: the Rock House, the Majestic, the Kitty Vitty Brewery, BB's Bistro. And so, if I want to have a good time and there's a show on, often that's the place that I wind up. In terms of others, I've mentioned Portage already. That's my favorite restaurant in the city. There's a few great bars around: the Grapevine, the Duke of Duckworth. I think many people have heard of Blue on Water. I'm there quite a bit. And Fred's Records. If I feel like dropping a couple $100 on a big stack of vinyl and then going back to the house that you said I couldn't mention, and listening to that. Um, I think those are some of the favorites between myself and my girlfriend. We routinely wind up at some of these places. Our first date was at the Grapevine Bar, actually. And then I think our second or third was at a drag show. So no complaints.
No complaints at all. So my final question for you, counselor, and it's an important one. And for the 850th time, what makes your community such a unique place to live, work, and to raise a family?
See, this is I think I've touched on it already. I think it's just there is a there is something intangible in the culture here that is. Oh, sorry, can you still hear me? My headphone did something strange.
Yep.
Fantastic.
So I'll cut.
Okay,
So
awesome.
hold on. We'll
Uh,
cut in and then go right back to the beginning. So right when I ask the question, so I can make the proper cut. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
okay. So I think, kind of like I said already, there is something in this community that is intangible. It's a beautiful place to live and to try and make a living. For all the challenges that we face, whether in terms of the fact that, we are a place that has, we have many challenges that we face as a city around housing, around poverty, around many things that many communities in the country are dealing with, or just the fact that we're, on a rock in the middle of the North Atlantic. It can be difficult to get here, and it can be difficult to sustain the weather in some cases. Um, Although I have heard that we mention the weather too much. If you're trying to attract people here, we can't do that. What makes it a great place to be? I We care about each other. We care about we care about the community. We care about this place. And I think that there's a real sense for many of us that we want to try and support each other. Is it always ideal? Is there still work we have to do to be more inclusive, to be more equitable? Yes, absolutely. But what makes it great? It's the people. And that's what, has sustained me in my time in office. That's why I've wanted to work hard to make this place better, because I care about it. I care about the people here, and I care about many communities here. I want everybody to live a beautiful and fulsome life in St. John's that is as enjoyable and peaceful and and happy as it can be. I want them to have incredible opportunities. I want to know that they can walk through the city freely, and you know, I want to know that they can have that same sense of pride that I felt when I got to move here finally, and that I still hold for this place, and that I think I always will. So, what makes it great? That's what I would say. I know that's a bit. I hope that's not too wishy-washy an answer, but it ultimately is the truth.
It's the best answer I get on this show is the people, the people, the people. Um, Councillor Ophelia, thank you so much for sitting down with me. It is always a pleasure to sit down with municipal leaders from coast to coast to coast here in Canada. I feel so honored that you came on and told your story, and we talked about yourself, talked about your community, and I look forward to hopefully when I'm in St. John's, we can go grab a coffee and take me to that vinyl shop because I'll spend a few $100 trying to bring all those vinyls back to Calgary, and my husband will not be happy with that. So I will blame the
All
counselor on
right.
that one. But
You
counselor,
absolutely can. There's a lot of great local vinyl. I'm thinking of the Kubasonics. I'm thinking of the Jigger, a few others. And no, we'll send you home with a big stack.
awesome. Counselor, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Cross Border Interviews. Now, we hope you've enjoyed today's conversation and gained some valuable insights into the world of Newfoundland and Labrador municipal politics from our guest today. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform or by visiting us on YouTube and clicking the subscribe button there, or follow us on all the social media channels to never miss an upcoming episode. Now, your support means the world to us. So share this episode with your friends, your family, and yes, even your community, and help keep the conversation going. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll be back with a brand new episode of Cross Border Interviews shortly.